Picture this. It's October 1884, and you're standing in the marble entrance hall of a building on the corner of 72nd Street and Central Park West, and you honestly cannot believe what you're seeing. You're a wealthy New Yorker. You live in a proper mansion on Fifth Avenue like all respectable people do, and you've come here today out of pure curiosity to see the apartment building that everyone's been talking about, the one they're calling Clark's Folly, the one that's supposed to convince rich people to live in apartments like common Europeans or middle-class families. The real estate agent, eager, slightly desperate to convince you this isn't completely insane, is showing you through rooms that are genuinely spectacular. 15-foot ceilings with elaborate plasterwork, massive windows overlooking Central Park, a dining room that seats 20, multiple parlors, 6 bedrooms, servants' quarters completely separate from family spaces, your own private entrance, fireplaces in every room, a bathroom, an actual bathroom with hot running water in your own home, not some shared facility. This apartment, he says, gesturing expansively, offers all the space and luxury of a Fifth Avenue mansion, but without the burden of managing an entire household alone. The building provides heat, maintains the common areas, employs staff for everyone's benefit. You get the lifestyle of a mansion with the convenience of modern living. You're trying to listen, but your mind is racing. An apartment. He's trying to convince you, someone who owns a 4-story townhouse with your own staff and your own everything, to move into an apartment building, to live in a space that, however grand, is still just one floor of a larger structure, to share a building with other families, share an entrance, share an address. This goes against everything you've been raised to believe about proper wealthy living. And yet, the rooms really are spectacular. The location, while remote now, overlooks the newly completed Central Park. The building itself looks like a castle, massive, imposing, clearly expensive, and the convenience he's describing, not having to manage heating systems, not maintaining your own power plant, not dealing with the constant headaches of running a large private house. What you don't know yet, what nobody quite understands in October 1884, is that you're looking at the future. That this building, this folly that everyone's been mocking for years, is about to change how wealthy New Yorkers live. That the man who built this, Edward Clark, who died 2 years ago and never saw his vision completed, was creating something revolutionary that would reshape the city's real estate and society. That this building was funded by one of the most scandalous fortunes in America, built on a remote location everyone said was ridiculous, designed with innovations nobody had seen before, and that despite every reason it should have failed, it's about to succeed spectacularly. If you're watching with tired eyes and an overthinking mind, this story is for you. If you really enjoy these bedtime journeys through history, please like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I always love knowing where these stories are keeping you company. Let's talk about the Dakota, how one man's controversial vision created New York's first luxury apartment building, and how a fortune built on sewing machines and scandal changed how the wealthy would live forever. The revolutionary concept that Edward Clark was proposing with the Dakota was genuinely radical for 1880s New York society. In that era, wealthy people lived in private mansions, period. Apartment buildings existed, certainly, but they were for middle-class families and working people who couldn't afford houses. They were called tenements or French flats, because Europeans lived in apartments, which Americans considered vaguely foreign and inferior, and they were definitely not appropriate residences for people of wealth and social standing. The very idea that someone rich would choose to live in an apartment, sharing a building with other families, having neighbors above and below rather than controlling an entire private structure, was considered slightly scandalous and definitely eccentric. Your home was supposed to be your castle, entirely yours. a physical manifestation of your wealth and independence. Living in an apartment suggested either poverty, you couldn't afford a house, or strange foreign affectations. Europeans might live this way, but Americans didn't. Edward Clarke was proposing something that violated these deeply held beliefs about appropriate wealthy living. He wanted to build an apartment building, but make it so luxurious, so spacious, so well appointed that wealthy people would actually want to live there. He was essentially trying to change the culture, to convince New York's elite that apartment living could be not just acceptable, but actually preferable to managing a private mansion. The skepticism was immediate and intense. When Clarke announced his plans in the late 1870s, the reaction from New York society was largely mockery. Wealthy people would never live in apartments, critics said. The location he'd chosen, 72nd Street and Central Park West, blocks north of where any fashionable people lived, was absurdly remote, practically wilderness. The whole project was financial suicide, a folly that would bankrupt him and stand as an expensive monument to poor judgment. But Edward Clarke had resources and conviction that allowed him to ignore the critics and proceed with his vision. And those resources came from a source far more colourful and scandalous than anyone building luxury real estate typically admits. The Singer sewing machine fortune, built by one of the most unconventional businessmen of the 19th century. Isaac Merritt Singer was a genuinely fascinating character whose personal life was so chaotic it makes modern celebrity scandals look tame. Born in 1811, Singer was an inventor and entrepreneur who didn't invent the sewing machine but significantly improved it and, more importantly, figured out how to market and sell it successfully on a massive scale. His business innovations, including installment payment plans that allowed ordinary families to afford sewing machines, made the Singer Company phenomenally successful and made Isaac Singer phenomenally wealthy. His personal life, however, was a spectacular mess. Singer fathered at least 24 children, possibly more, records are incomplete, with 5 different women, conducting multiple simultaneous relationships, marrying some partners and not others, moving between households, creating a family situation so complicated that even he probably couldn't keep track of all his children's names and ages. This wasn't a quiet scandal kept private. Singer's domestic chaos was public knowledge and the subject of considerable gossip and judgment. In an era when respectable people maintained appearances of propriety, even if their private lives were complicated, Singer made no effort to hide his unconventional arrangement. He lived openly with multiple women, acknowledged most of his children, moved between families without apparent shame or concern for public opinion. The business partner who had to manage both the company and Singer's chaos was Edward Clarke, a cautious lawyer who'd helped Singer establish the company and who provided the business acumen and organizational skills that Singer lacked. Clarke was everything Singer wasn't: methodical, respectable, concerned with propriety and reputation, capable of long-term planning. He managed the company's finances, its legal issues, its expansion, essentially running the business while Singer generated publicity and scandal in equal measure. The partnership was strained by Singer's personal chaos. His complicated domestic life created legal issues about inheritance and business control. His spending was extravagant and difficult to manage, and his public scandals potentially damaged the company's reputation. But the partnership was also phenomenally profitable. The Singer Sewing Machine Company became one of the most successful businesses in America, and both Singer and Clarke became extraordinarily wealthy. When Isaac Singer died in 1875, Edward Clarke gained full control of the company and its massive profits. He'd spent years managing Singer's messes, and now he had the resources and authority to pursue his own vision without having to accommodate Singer's chaos or spending. The Singer fortune, built on innovations in sewing machines, but also on installment payment plans that made the machines affordable to working families, was now Clark's to manage and invest as he saw fit. Clark was already wealthy before Singer's death, but now he was wealthy on a scale that allowed him to pursue projects that others would consider impossibly risky or expensive. And one of those projects was his vision for luxury apartment living, the Dakota. The decision to build on 72nd Street in Central Park West was controversial for good reasons. In the early 1880s, fashionable New York essentially ended around 59th Street. Everything north of that was largely undeveloped, empty lots, scattered buildings, definitely not where wealthy people lived. Central Park had been completed in the 1870s, creating a beautiful public space, but the area around it remained remote and unfashionable. Clark chose this location deliberately, not despite its remoteness, but partly because of it. Land was cheaper than prime Fifth Avenue locations, allowing him to build on a scale that wouldn't be affordable downtown. The location offered views of Central Park, which Clark believed would become increasingly valuable as the city grew northward. And the remoteness actually served his purposes. He was creating something new and unusual, and putting it in an established neighborhood would subject it to constant comparison with traditional mansions. Placing it in a developing area gave it room to establish itself on its own terms. But to critics, the location was proof that Clark had lost his mind. They called it Clark's Folly, and joked that the building was so far from civilization, you might as well be in the Dakota territory. Hence, some say, the building's eventual name, though the actual origin of the Dakota is debated. Who would want to live so far north? How would wealthy residents get downtown? What about the social isolation of being removed from fashionable neighborhoods? Clark apparently believed that if the building was spectacular enough, if the apartments were luxurious enough, location wouldn't matter. People would come because the living itself was desirable, and he had the Singer fortune to spend making the building spectacular enough to prove his theory. He hired Henry Janeway Hardenberg, one of New York's most prestigious architects, to design the building. Hardenberg was an excellent choice. Talented, ambitious, capable of creating the kind of impressive structure that Clark's vision required. He would later design the Plaza Hotel, but the Dakota was his first major commission, his chance to create something genuinely innovative. The design Hardenberg created was remarkable, a massive structure built around a central courtyard, designed in an eclectic style mixing German Renaissance and French chateau elements, featuring towers and gables and ornamental details that made it look like a European castle transported to New York. The building was constructed of Indiana limestone and yellow brick, materials that were expensive but durable and impressive. The scale was enormous, 9 stories, including basement level, covering most of the block frontage, containing approximately 65 apartments, ranging from 4 to 20 rooms each. The largest apartments were genuinely massive, 10,000 square feet or more, comparable in size to entire mansions, with dining rooms that seated 20, multiple parlors, 6 or more bedrooms, elaborate private spaces for families who were used to having entire houses to themselves. But the real innovation wasn't just size, it was the building's systems and services, the features that were designed to make apartment living actually more convenient than mansion living. The Dakota had its own power plant in the basement, generating electricity and heat for the entire building. This meant residents didn't have to manage their own heating systems, didn't have to maintain coal delivery and furnaces, and didn't have to deal with any of the mechanical infrastructure that made private houses complicated to run. The building had hydraulic elevators, advanced technology for the 1880s, making upper floors accessible and desirable rather than requiring residents to climb multiple flights of stairs. This was revolutionary because it meant that being on higher floors was actually preferable. better views, more privacy, rather than being the cheap space where servants lived. There was a separate circulation system for residents and servants. Family entrances and elevators were completely separate from service entrances and service elevators. This meant that residents could live without constantly encountering the servants who maintained the building, preserving the privacy and class segregation that wealthy families expected, while actually making the logistics easier by having dedicated service infrastructure. The building was designed to have its own staff, eventually employing around 150 people, including doormen, maintenance workers, cleaners, a building superintendent who managed operations. This meant residents didn't have to employ full household staff themselves. They might have personal servants living in their apartment's servants' quarters, but the building itself provided many services collectively that individual mansion owners had to manage privately. There was a communal dining room in the basement, a restaurant essentially, where residents could eat rather than preparing meals in their own apartments. There were laundry facilities, tailoring services, and various amenities designed to make life convenient. The building was conceived as providing hotel-like services, but with the privacy and space of home ownership. The architectural details throughout were expensive and impressive. Marble floors in entrance halls, elaborate woodwork in apartments, decorative plasterwork on ceilings, fireplace mantels that were works of art, hardware and fixtures that were the finest available. Clark spared no expense making the building luxurious enough to appeal to people who were accustomed to living in mansions and who had high expectations for quality and beauty. The construction took years. Groundbreaking was in 1880, and the building wasn't completed until October 1884. The cost was substantial. Estimates range around $2 million, equivalent to perhaps $60 million today, though the actual amount is disputed, and Clark's private financing makes it difficult to determine exact figures. This was an enormous investment in an unproven concept, built on an unfashionable location, requiring Clark to spend years watching his vision slowly take shape, while critics mocked him and questioned his judgment. Tragically, Edward Clark died in 1882, 2 years before the Dakota was completed. He died of malarial fever at age 73, having spent the previous years managing construction and planning, having poured his fortune and his energy into creating this building, having endured years of criticism and mockery about Clark's folly. He never saw the completed building. He never knew whether his controversial vision would succeed or fail. He invested everything in proving that wealthy people would choose apartment living if it was luxurious enough, and he died before knowing whether he was right. His family continued the project, seeing it through completion, honoring his vision by finishing what he'd started. And when the Dakota officially opened in October 1884, something remarkable happened that vindicated Clark's belief and silenced the critics. All 65 apartments were rented by opening day, not gradually filled over months or years, not partially occupied with some apartments sitting empty while the building struggled to find tenants. Fully rented immediately. Wealthy New Yorkers, despite all their stated objections to apartment living, despite the building's remote location, despite years of calling it Clark's Folly, actually wanted to live there enough that every apartment was claimed before the building even officially opened. This wasn't just success, this was triumph, proof that Clark's controversial vision was actually correct, that wealthy people would indeed choose luxury apartments over managing private mansions if the apartments were spectacular enough and convenient enough. The building that everyone had mocked became immediately desirable, establishing itself overnight as one of New York's most prestigious addresses. The early tenants were exactly the kind of wealthy, socially prominent people Clark had envisioned: successful businessmen, society families, people who had options and who chose the Dakota not out of necessity, but because they genuinely preferred what it offered. They appreciated the space and luxury of the apartments, certainly, but they also appreciated the convenience, not managing heating, not maintaining infrastructure, having building staff handle many tasks that would otherwise require personal servants, and being able to enjoy mansion-scale living without mansion-scale management responsibility. The building's success transformed New York real estate and wealthy living patterns. Within a few years, other luxury apartment buildings began appearing, copying the Dakota's model, trying to replicate its success. The concept that had seemed radical and scandalous in 1880 became accepted and fashionable by 1890. Edward Clark had single-handedly changed how wealthy New Yorkers thought about residential architecture and lifestyle. The Dakota remained in the Clark family for 77 years after Edward's death, passed through his descendants, maintained as something between an investment property and a family legacy. The Clarks apparently saw the building as Edward's monument, his achievement that deserved preservation and respect, rather than just being treated as a purely commercial asset to be managed for maximum profit. This family ownership had interesting effects on the building's character. Rents were kept relatively low by market standards. The Clarks could have charged more, but they apparently prioritized maintaining the building's prestige and Edward's vision over maximizing rental income. As a result, the Dakota became known as an excellent value, a prestigious address that was actually affordable for people who weren't absurdly wealthy, creating a tenant base that was cultured and interesting rather than just rich. There were no vacancies between 1884 and 1929, a remarkable record suggesting that once people moved into the Dakota, they stayed. The building created the kind of loyal residents who didn't leave even when other options became available. This stability reinforced the building's prestige and community feeling, creating a sense that living at the Dakota was a privilege to be treasured rather than just a rental arrangement to be abandoned when something better came along. The building attracted artists, musicians, writers, intellectuals, creative people who appreciated the space and the community and the building's unique character. This cultural richness became part of the Dakota's identity, making it not just a luxury address but a creative hub, a place where interesting people lived and worked and contributed to New York's cultural life. When Stephen Carlton Clark died in 1960, ownership passed to the Clark Foundation, a charitable organization that was legally required to maximize returns on assets and couldn't justify holding a rent-controlled building as a family legacy. The foundation sold the Dakota to a developer who initially planned to demolish it and replace it with a modern high-rise, a plan that horrified the tenants and that prompted them to fight to save the building. The tenants organized, hired lawyers, lobbied for landmark designation, and created public pressure against demolition. Their efforts succeeded. The Dakota was designated a landmark in 1969, ensuring its preservation and preventing the demolition that would have destroyed Edward Clark's vision and one of New York's most architecturally significant buildings. The tenants' successful fight demonstrated that the Dakota had become more than just a building. It was a cultural landmark worth preserving, a piece of New York history that belonged to the city, not just to its owner. The building's most famous chapter came later, in the 1970s and 1980s, when it became home to numerous celebrities and particularly to John Lennon and Yoko Ono. Lennon was attracted to the Dakota for the same reasons wealthy New Yorkers had been a century earlier: the space, the privacy, the building's character and history. He and Yoko lived there from 1973 onward, raising their son Sean, recording music, becoming part of the building's community. The Dakota's archway, the covered entrance that carriages had once passed through, became tragically famous on December 8, 1980, when John Lennon was shot and killed there by a disturbed fan. The murder shocked the world, transformed the archway into an informal memorial, and forever associated the Dakota with both Lennon's creative life and his tragic death. The section of Central Park directly across from the Dakota was later renamed Strawberry Field, a memorial garden dedicated to Lennon's memory and his vision of peace. At its center is a mosaic with the word imagine, referencing Lennon's most famous song, creating a permanent tribute visible from the Dakota, where he'd lived and where he died. This connection to Lennon gave the Dakota new cultural significance. It was no longer just a historic luxury apartment building, but also a site of pilgrimage for music fans, a place associated with creativity and tragedy, a building whose identity was now intertwined with one of the 20th century's most influential musicians. But the Lennon connection, while significant, was really just the latest chapter in a story that began a century earlier with Edward Clarke's controversial vision. The Dakota was revolutionary when it was built, changing how wealthy people thought about urban living, demonstrating that apartments could be not just acceptable, but actually preferable to private mansions if they were designed thoughtfully and luxuriously. The building that everyone mocked as Clarke's Folly became one of New York's most prestigious and architecturally significant addresses, surviving for over 140 years, outlasting the Gilded Age that created it, becoming a landmark that's protected and treasured. Edward Clarke's vision was vindicated not just immediately by the building's opening success, but continuously across more than a century of prestige and desirability. The Dakota changed New York real estate fundamentally. Before it was built, wealthy people lived in private mansions, and apartments were for the middle and working classes. After it succeeded, luxury apartments became an accepted and desirable option, eventually becoming the dominant form of wealthy urban living. The trajectory of New York residential architecture, the shift from townhouses to apartment buildings, the development of the Upper West Side, the creation of co-ops and luxury condominiums, all traces back to Edward Clarke's willingness to risk his fortune on a controversial idea that everyone said would fail. The building demonstrated something important about innovation and vision, that sometimes the ideas that seem most radical and most likely to fail are actually seeing the future more clearly than the conventional wisdom that mocks them. Edward Clarke was ridiculed for Clarke's Folly, for building luxury apartments in a remote location, for thinking wealthy people would share buildings. He died before knowing he was right. But he was right, spectacularly right, in ways that changed how millions of people would eventually live. The Dakota stands today as a monument to Clarke's vision and also to the singer fortune that funded it, that scandalous, chaotic fortune built on sewing machines and installment payments, generated by Isaac Singer's innovations and Edward Clarke's management, invested in a building that would outlast both of them and that would change New York. When you stand outside the Dakota today, and it's a tourist destination now, partly because of its architecture, partly because of the Lennon connection, you're looking at a building that was genuinely revolutionary when it was created. The castle-like structure that dominates the corner of 72nd and Central Park West was once surrounded by empty lots and was mocked as folly. Now it's surrounded by the Upper West Side that grew up around it, proven right by the neighborhood that developed exactly as Clarke predicted it would. The apartments inside, those 15-foot ceilings, those massive rooms, that separate servant circulation, still exist largely as they were designed in the 1880s. Modern residents live in spaces designed for Gilded Age sensibilities, enjoying the luxury and space that Edward Clarke believed wealthy people would want if it was offered to them. The building has been updated with modern systems and amenities, obviously, but the fundamental vision remains Clarke's, the architectural character remains Hardenberg's, and the connection to the past remains tangible. The Dakota is one of relatively few Gilded Age structures that has survived not just physically, but functionally, still serving its original purpose, still housing wealthy residents in luxury apartments, still demonstrating that Clarke's controversial vision was actually timeless rather than just a quirk of his era. Most Gilded Age mansions are gone, demolished, or converted to museums, or divided into smaller units. The Dakota remains, vindicated and celebrated, proof that sometimes the folly everyone mocks is actually the vision that changes everything. Edward Clarke spent years enduring criticism for his controversial project, invested a fortune in an unproven concept, and died before seeing whether he was right. But he was right. The Dakota succeeded immediately, transformed New York real estate, established a model that would be copied endlessly, created a building that would outlast the Gilded Age and become a landmark treasured for its architecture and its history and its connection to both the past and to continuing creative life. The building that everyone called Clarke's Folly became Clarke's Triumph, proof that innovation requires vision to see what others can't, courage to pursue what others mock, and resources to execute at a scale that makes the vision real. Edward Clarke had all three. The singer fortune provided resources. His legal training and business experience provided the organizational capability, and his personal conviction about luxury apartment living provided the vision that everyone said was wrong, but that proved to be absolutely transformatively right. The Dakota's transformation into a haven for creative people, the trajectory that eventually led to John Lennon living there, actually began during the Clarke family ownership era and accelerated after the building became a co-op in the 1960s. The relatively low rents during the Clarke era and the building's unique character attracted artists, writers, musicians, and theatre people who appreciated the space and the community, even if they weren't extraordinarily wealthy by New York standards. By the mid-20th century, the Dakota had developed a reputation as the building where interesting people lived, not just rich people, but creative people, intellectuals, performers, people who contributed to New York's cultural life rather than just consuming it. This reputation made it increasingly attractive to exactly those kinds of residents, creating a self-reinforcing cycle where the Dakota became known as the artistic building, the creative building, the place where you might encounter fascinating people in the elevator rather than just wealthy socialites. The list of notable residents who've lived at the Dakota over the decades reads like a who's who of American cultural life. Lauren Bacall, the legendary actress, lived there for decades and became one of the building's most famous long-term residents and fiercest defenders of its character and standards. Leonard Bernstein, the composer and conductor, lived there during some of his most productive creative years. Judy Garland lived there briefly. Boris Karloff lived there. Roberta Flack lived there. These weren't people choosing the Dakota primarily for status or pure luxury. They were choosing it for the space. Artists need room to work. The privacy, the building's thick walls and solid construction offered genuine quiet. The community, living among other creative people, and the building's connection to New York's cultural history. The Dakota's co-op board became famous, or infamous, for being extremely selective about who was allowed to purchase apartments. This wasn't just about wealth or fame. The board reportedly rejected numerous wealthy and famous applicants who they felt wouldn't fit the building's character or community. Stories circulated about celebrities being turned down. Cher was reportedly rejected. Billy Joel was rejected. The board apparently prioritized maintaining the building's particular atmosphere over maximizing apartment sale prices or courting celebrity residents. This selectivity reinforced the Dakota's mystique and prestige. Being accepted by the Dakota's board became a mark of cultural legitimacy, suggesting that you weren't just rich or famous, but that you were the right kind of person for this particular community. The building became aspirational, not just as a luxury address, but as a cultural statement. Living at the Dakota meant you'd been deemed worthy by a board that valued artistic achievement and cultural contribution over mere wealth or celebrity. When John Lennon and Yoko Ono applied to purchase an apartment in 1973, the board's decision to accept them was significant. Lennon was at the height of his fame, enormously wealthy, but also controversial. His political activism, his experimental art, his unconventional lifestyle could have made him seem like a risky resident. The board's acceptance suggested that they valued his artistic significance and his genuine interest in being part of the community over any concerns about his celebrity causing disruption. Lennon apparently loved the Dakota immediately and deeply. He appreciated the space. The apartment he and Yoko purchased and eventually expanded was large enough for his music studio, for Yoko's art, for raising their son Sean, with room to grow and play. He appreciated the privacy. The building's thick walls and solid construction meant he could make music without disturbing neighbors, could live without constant intrusion, could walk through the building without being constantly approached by fans or press. He also apparently appreciated the building's history and character. Lennon was interested in New York history, in the city's cultural legacy, in being part of something with depth and meaning, rather than just living in a modern luxury box. The Dakota offered that connection to history, that sense of living in a building that had witnessed over 90 years of New York life, that had architectural character and cultural significance beyond just being expensive real estate. During the 7 years Lennon lived at the Dakota, he became a genuine resident rather than just a celebrity passing through. He walked in the neighborhood, took Sean to the park, interacted with other residents, and participated in the building's community. Other residents reportedly appreciated that despite his fame, he was a good neighbor, respectful of the building's character, not creating disruptions, living as a person rather than as a celebrity demanding special treatment. His murder in the archway on December 8, 1980, was thus not just the death of a famous musician, but the violent intrusion into a community, the destruction of one of their own in a space that was supposed to be safe and private. The archway where he was shot, the same archway that carriages had passed through in the 1880s, the covered entrance that was architecturally distinctive and that residents passed through daily, became a site of trauma and mourning for the building's community and for millions of fans worldwide. The Dakota handled the aftermath with the same discretion and protection of privacy that had attracted Lennon in the first place. They didn't turn the building into a spectacle, didn't capitalize on the tragedy, maintained their standards about who was allowed in and how the building operated. Yoko Ono continued living there, raising Sean there, eventually expanding their apartment further, creating a home where Lennon's legacy was honored privately rather than displayed publicly. The creation of strawberry fields in Central Park, directly across from the Dakota, provided a public memorial space, allowing fans to mourn and remember without turning the building itself into a pilgrimage site. The mosaic with Imagine at its center became the focal point for annual gatherings on Lennon's birthday and the anniversary of his death, giving people a place to commemorate him that was near where he'd lived, but that didn't intrude on the building's privacy or the residents' daily lives. The Lennon connection has made the Dakota more famous globally than it might have been based purely on its architectural and real estate significance. People who've never been to New York and who have no interest in Gilded Age architecture know the Dakota as the building where John Lennon lived and died. This fame has been a mixed blessing for the building and its residents. It's increased the building's prestige and probably its property value, but it's also meant dealing with tourists, taking photos, fans making pilgrimages, the building's identity being partially defined by tragedy rather than just by its history and character. But the Lennon era is really just one chapter in the Dakota's long story, a significant chapter certainly, one that connected the building to 20th century cultural history in ways that Edward Clarke could never have imagined. but still just one part of a narrative that began in the 1880s with a controversial vision about how wealthy people might choose to live. The Dakota today remains what Edward Clark envisioned, a luxury residence offering space and services that make urban living not just acceptable, but desirable for people who have resources and options. The building that was supposed to fail, that everyone mocked as folly, that critics said wealthy people would never accept, has not only survived for over 140 years, but has thrived, maintaining prestige and desirability across multiple eras and massive social changes. It stands as proof that Edward Clarke's vision was correct, that luxury apartment living was indeed the future of urban residence for wealthy people, that the building he never saw completed would outlast the Gilded Age that created it and would continue attracting residents who valued space and character and connection to history over more modern but less distinctive alternatives. The Dakota, funded by a scandalous sewing machine fortune, built on a remote location everyone mocked, designed to convince wealthy people to abandon mansions for apartments, completed after its visionary died, succeeded beyond what even Clarke might have imagined, becoming not just a successful luxury building, but a New York landmark, a piece of architectural history, a home to generations of creative people, and ultimately, a building whose name is known worldwide as both a Gilded Age triumph and a 20th century cultural touchstone.